I want to take you back almost 10 years to a hot summer Sunday evening in Fresno, California. It's 11 p.m. I'm thinking about wrapping up what I've been working on when suddenly my phone starts vibrating. I check the screen, and it's a contract developer and friend of mine, Derek Reimer, who was doing contract work for me on Hittail and on this new project I was working on that was later to be named Drip. The problem was, Derek and I didn't call each other. We always texted. So I answered the phone with, "Uh-oh, is everything okay?" And his response, his first question was, "Do we have a backup of the database?" It turns out through a slip of the finger, he had forgotten a where clause on an update statement and had effectively deleted every customer credit card we had on file. This was one of those moments where you think to yourself, I wonder if we're going to make it through this. And in this video, I'm going to tell you the full story and also talk about 4 key takeaways that I learned about dealing with this situation. I'm Rob Walling. I've started 6 companies, 5 of them bootstrapped. I've written 4 books on entrepreneurship, and I've invested in more than 150 startups. If you stick around till the end of the video, I'm going to tell you how we ultimately arranged things so we would have had very little downtime, even if we lost our entire database. So Derek and I are on the phone. We're trying to troubleshoot how to get this data back in the database. We know that we have a database backup, but we have a contract DBA who was a freelancer, but he was a guy I'd worked with for quite some time. He was in Poland, so he was on a European time zone. I think it was 11 o'clock Pacific time where I was, which put it around 7 a.m. his time. So I go into Skype. This shows how long ago it was. We didn't use Slack at the time. And I emailed him and we tried to get a hold of our DBA to figure out, can we restore this table? It should be possible, right? If we have backups, this should be relatively easy. I will say, as a developer, if you've ever forgotten a where clause on an update statement or a delete a row statement, I've done this myself at least twice. Derek had done it in production, in essence, in Drip. In the early Drip database, we had 100, maybe 200 paying customers. He felt terrible. And this is where those of us who are our hardest critics, the person who is most angry about this is usually ourselves. And I told Derek, look, don't feel bad. This is a mistake. We'll figure out in the future how not to make it. But for now, let's sit down and figure out what our options are. So before I tell you how the story wound up, let's look at what we can learn from this experience. I have 4 items to walk through. The first is that if you're building startups, catastrophes are inevitable. I've seen founders or their companies get hacked. I've seen folks lose customer data. I've seen cease and desist, lawsuits, a critical platform banning or blocking API access. Every one of those and more has happened to companies that I'm invested in, companies that I've owned. It is inevitable if you do this long enough and you do enough interesting and risky things, the catastrophes will happen. So the key is to stay calm and look at all the possible solutions. Rally your team or yourself and get to fixing it. You can panic for a minute, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, then take a deep breath and think, what are all my options? The second step when this happens is to do just that. It's to look at all the solutions that you have, put them in order of which we want to chase down. Sometimes if you have a team, you're going to be chasing 2 simultaneously and then act, then get to fixing things. As Derek and I discussed our options, we knew that the best option was to get a hold of our DBA if we could and restore the table from the database backup. But we realized maybe the DBA was out for the day. Maybe the DBA wouldn't respond, or maybe it's always possible that your backups don't work and that we wouldn't be able to restore the database table. So then what was plan B? Plan B for us was realizing that the actual credit card numbers were stored in Stripe. And what we had lost in the table was a customer token that linked us to Stripe. We hadn't lost the actual credit card numbers. So we would have been a pain, we could have manually mapped each customer from our database to Stripe using the name field or an email address or some other identifier. It would have been manual, but it probably would have gotten us at least 95% of the cards, maybe all the way to 100%. Not the ideal solution, but at least it's something that would work if plan A wasn't coming through. And then we came up with a third option, which was if somehow mapping them manually wouldn't work, we can email all of these customers and ask them to input their credit card number again. This is far from an ideal option. I bet we would have lost 10, 20, 30% of our customer base. It would have been a large number and it would have been disappointing, but it's not business ending. That's a thing to keep in mind, is even things that sound like a catastrophe, like losing all my customers' credit card information, these are just speed bumps. They're not roadblocks. It wouldn't have ended expanded our business. And in fact, grew to become a multi-million-dollar company that I sold for enough money that I never had to work again. And we had many catastrophes like this along the way. And each one we sat down, we planned, and then we figured out how to fix it. The third lesson to learn from this is to plan for bad things to happen and to hopefully mitigate them in advance. So there's a balance here. You don't want to build a $10,000 fence around $1,000 in cash. But there are things that are pretty likely to happen as you grow, including things I've already mentioned, like data loss, getting hacked, being sued, having a cease and desist sent to you, having application downtime. How can you spend a small amount of time and or money to protect against each of these? Having backups of your database, paying a third party like Tiny Seed company Glitch Secure to do pen testing or security audits, having insurance in place, having a protective corporate structure in case you do get sued that you don't get personally sued. There are so many ways to think about mitigating some of the more common things that can happen to you. And if you prepare for bad things to happen without expecting them to, you can do your future self a favor. And the fourth thing to learn from this is specifically with database backups, because data loss is something that is actually quite likely to happen in the life of your startup, whether accidental, whether it's on purpose, whether your hard drives fail, or whether you miss a where clause. It's to not only have backups, but test your backups. Test your backups over and over. I have heard the same story 10, 20 times about companies that back up their database, but they never test the restoration process. I have seen entire startups doing 6 figures in ARR. I think there was one that was in 7 and they had to shut down. They had to shut down because they had backups that just didn't work. They didn't restore. So what I've always done is paid a DBA, a database administrator, a few $100s a month to not only make sure the backups run, but to test those backups once a month. And our DBA would restore the backup and then run several queries against it to ensure the backups were working. With things like mitigating data loss, a little bit of effort and planning goes a long way. I'm sure by now you're wondering, how did this all end up? Did we lose the credit cards? Did we need plan A, plan B, or plan C? The end result of our journey to get the credit cards back ended very quickly. Within a half an hour, our DBA was awake. He said, no problem. He grabbed the most recent database backups, did a restore, and in no time, we had all of our credit cards just like we'd had an hour before. It was a fairy tale ending for something that could have obviously gone pretty poorly, but following the steps that I outlined in this video, we had a couple of backups even if that initial plan hadn't worked. In a minute, I'm going to tell you how we eventually got to the point where we would have had almost zero downtime even if we'd lost our entire database. But before that, I want to recommend, if you like this YouTube channel and you're into podcasts, I have 2 podcasts to recommend that are related to this channel. Startups for the Rest of Us is the first one. I'm approaching 700 weekly episodes. I've been recording about 30 minutes every week for 13 years. It's all about building, launching, and growing bootstrapped and mostly bootstrapped SaaS companies, just like we talk about on this channel. The other one is the MicroConf podcast. Just search for MicroConf in any place you get podcasts. That's where we pull some of the audio from these YouTube videos like you're watching, as well as a lot of our MicroConf talks, and we put them in an easy to consume podcast feed. So how did we get to the point where we would have had almost zero downtime? Well, this is not something you want to do from day one because it's expensive. But once you get further along, you have a lot of paying customers, you have revenue. We paid for a complete hot swappable replica of our database. It was a live backup. It was expensive, but it meant we would have had close to zero downtime if something happened to our database, which was one of the only single points of failure in our application because everything else was spread across multiple servers. The front-end interface, the APIs, our queuing, all of that was a bunch of servers running. But with our database, since it was a single server, that was a single point of failure. If you want to hear more about Drip, which is the business that I was building when all this happened, check out this next video to get the backstory of building a SaaS app to millions of dollars in annual revenue.